Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel, and today I wanted to talk about a topic that I think a lot of perhaps more experienced fitness professionals or even people that have been lifting weights for a long time or just want to know about some of the acute training variables regarding resistance training. And so the key topic here this week or with this video is high volume training versus low volume training. And when I say volume, typically we're talking about sets per muscle group, and typically we talk about sets maybe per week per muscle group or per session or per workout per week. Now technically the volume of exercise regarding strength training is the number of repetitions completed in a set or even in a workout multiplied times the resistance or the load. And here in the United States we mainly use pounds. So if we did a set of chest presses for 10 reps at 100 pounds, that would be 10 times 100, that would be 1,000 pounds. So that's technically how a volume is quantified, but in most circles, especially in strength training circles, we typically think of it as sets per muscle group because it's sort of implied that you're doing anywhere from probably 4 to even up to 15 or 20 reps per set. But of course, the more reps one did, especially at least to a degree, then the more volume it could be. But the point is not to do a calculation of volume, but to discuss the number of sets you should do per muscle group per week to produce the greatest benefit. And I will say that there's a number of scientific studies been done. I've done some studies with using moderate volumes per week per muscle group. In the first study that I did, we had participants exercising with basically 9 sets per muscle group per week, and we had one group that did 3 sets 3 times per week, while the other per muscle group, and then the other group did all 9 sets per muscle group in one day per week. So the only variable was frequency, and we found that if the participants were doing the same volume in that particular study, 9 sets per week, that it did not matter if they did 3 sets on 3 occasions or all 9 sets per muscle group per week. Okay, so basically it was split body part training versus total body training. And definitely, if you want to hear more about that study, I can definitely do a screencast and walk you through the whole study with the paper on the screen and walk through the results and what those mean. But we did 9 sets per muscle group per week in both interventions, and we found after 8 weeks, an 8-week time frame, that both groups improved in strength and muscle mass, at 9 sets per muscle group. Okay. And then we did the second study in which we had participants do a whole lot of training volume. Basically, they did 30 sets per muscle group per week, and these were very advanced participants, and they gained rapid muscle mass, okay? Rapid amounts of muscle mass in just 2 weeks and 4 weeks. And we assessed muscle mass or lean tissue mass gains using a DEXA scanner, and that is really considered the gold standard in body composition assessment. These advanced participants, this study just lasted 4 weeks, and they again completed 30 sets per muscle group per week. They essentially trained the whole body, doing 5 sets of each muscle group on 6 days a week. So a whole lot of training volume over just 4 weeks, and they did improve dramatically and more than what we saw in the first study even, and that study went out 8 weeks. So the higher volume approach, if you could compare both studies, certainly the higher volume approach I believe was probably more effective for those advanced trainees, and I think a lot of the literature does show that the more sets you do per week per muscle group, that you may gain more amounts of muscle mass and strength. Now, what I will say is I think it all works. I think doing 1, 2, or 3, which is a small number of sets per week, works as well. And I think there's some literature being produced and some science being done that shows that that studies that have people do lower volumes also improve in strength and muscle mass. And then, my study, and there's some other higher volume studies that show, guess what? That they also improve in muscle mass and strength. And then, just to speak with the study that I did over 4 weeks, I can tell you this: at the end of the 4 weeks of that large group, I think there was, we could look at I'd have to review, but I think there was between 26 and 30 participants in that study. Every one of them was ready to quit the program. It was with that amount of work, where they're training 6 days a week over 4 weeks, it was time to change something. So what would the next phase of training be had we were to implement another phase? They were doing high volume, then it would make sense to shift to a lower volume approach, right? So we've altered our training volumes. And so when people ask me how many sets per week should I do, and I think a good answer would be, what are you currently doing and how long have you been doing it? If you're currently doing high volume training, and I would consider higher number of set totals per week, anything over probably, I would consider anything over 10 to be considered higher volume, then it probably is time to take a 3 or 4 week period where you go low volume. Okay, and especially if you're highly trained. If you've been strength training, I think you need to vary your training. And you need to vary your training based on number of sets per week. So you might do 4 weeks of high volume, over 10 sets per muscle group per week, whether you do split training or total body training, do higher volume. And then for at least as long, probably as long as you did the high volume, for maybe 3 to 4 weeks, go lower volume and vary your volume. You wouldn't have to change anything. You could do the same number of reps per set, but just lower the volume, okay? And maybe lower your volume. If you're doing 10 sets per muscle group, for 4 weeks, and then cut it to maybe 3 or 4. And then you could do that for 4 or 5 weeks, 4 weeks of lower volume, and see if you're improving in strength. My bet is that you do improve in strength. And then you could gradually build back up, maybe go, from 3 to 4 sets per muscle group to 6 to 8. After you've stayed static at the 3 to 4 sets per muscle group per week for 4 weeks. So you go 4 weeks high, 4 weeks low, and then after you've done the 4 weeks of low, then gradually start stepping it back up to the higher volume approach, okay, if you wanted to do that. Now, I will say this: I do believe that lower volume training over a longer period of time is probably going to be just as effective as higher volume training. So many participants, when they first start strength training, I think following a much lower volume approach where it's linear, it's focused on progressive overload, I think that is probably the best approach to take. So I don't want to confuse you and say, just when you're first starting a strength training program, start off doing a whole lot of volume and then do that for 4 weeks and then cut it in half. Those are only for the very advanced trainees, okay? But I think in the beginning stages of training, you may only want to do 2 or 3 sets per muscle group or per exercise and see if you're progressing in strength, okay? And I really believe that is a very good gauge as to whether or not your strength training programming is working, okay? But the bottom line is, over time, whenever you're going to hit a plateau. And I think one major way to overcome a plateau is to change your training volume, okay? You can change your frequency as well, but I think changing and alternating your volume is the way to go. So to answer the question, is high volume more effective than low volume? The answer is yes. The answer, the next question is lower volume more effective than high volume? The answer is yes. They're both effective. It just depends on what you're currently doing. If you've been training with the same program for the last 6 months or a year, like so many do, the first change I would make if you're doing higher volume is cut your volume in half at least. And do that for 3 or 4 weeks and see if you're improving. And then maybe gradually work your way up. If you've been doing super low volume, I know there's some YouTube channels with high intensity training where they use extremely 1 set per muscle group. And I believe that's an effective way to train. You just can't train that way forever. The body is going to adapt. And adding volume in that case is probably the thing to do. Okay? So no one has all the answers. I think one thing to keep in mind is to change your program over time and changing and alternating periods of higher volume with periods of lower volume, and that whole thing is called periodization. And really that's one really nice way to periodize your training. But the real key is to train progressively, be practical, and don't do too much volume. Don't let the amount of volume you do exceed your ability to recover from it. And track your progress. Try to progress. And if you're progressing and you're only doing 1 to 3 sets per muscle group per week, why do you need to change until you hit a plateau? Okay, and then you would want to change your training volume. So that's the take-home message: is don't get stuck in a rut of doing the same thing indefinitely. If you're doing high volume, if you're doing 5 sets of each exercise, cut it down to 1 for a few weeks, and then maybe gradually build up. Okay? If you're doing just 1 set per muscle group per week, and you've been doing that for 6 months or a year, and you've probably improved your strength dramatically, maybe add a couple more sets, and don't train quite as intensely, and don't train to fatigue per set. So always be changing, thinking about how you can alter your training volume and intensity. So there's a lot to this, and I think over time, I think that's one really important reason to get help and to get someone else on your team to be able to make your training most effective. But don't get me wrong, even if you do higher volume training, I don't think you need to spend multiple hours per week doing strength training. I do believe you can do an effective program in certainly under 2 hours a week. I believe that. So that's it for this week's video. Talk to you later. If you do have questions, please leave questions in the comments. I know this can be confusing because we as humans, we want to say, oh, there's my ideal program and I'll stick with it forever. And it just doesn't work that way. Our bodies are very marvelously designed to adapt to whatever we give them. And so we constantly need to be altering those training variables, specifically volume. That's it. Talk to you soon.